It's been a long wait, but God of War is finally here. And you know what? It's pretty good. It's the kind of reimagining that you don't often see in this industry, the kind that's wildly different from all of its predecessors, but still somehow very, very true to the identity of the franchise it belongs to. And it is wildly different, from the huge things such as the camera and the combat, to the little ones such as the voice acting. Almost everything here is new, but still very familiar. Because for all that is different in this game, it's still very much a continuation of the franchise and of Kratos' story. Quite recently, we did a complete story recap of the franchise. You can find the links in the description below. And now we're going to recap the entire story of the new game in as much detail as we can. So sit back and enjoy as we jump right into it. Obviously, there will be spoilers in this feature. Given the vast nature of this game, especially in comparison to all of its predecessors, we're going to tell the story of the game across multiple parts of the story so far. In the first part, which is part 7 for our Story So Far series here at GamingBolt overall, while we will speak a little about the beginning of the game's story, our focus for this part will mostly be on other prerequisite important information. We'll spend quite a bit of time talking about details from actual Norse mythology that are vital to the game's plot, before going on to talk a bit about some of the most important side characters in the game, who will actually be quite vital as we move forward. One of the biggest changes the game has made to the series is that it's moved away from its previous setting of Greek mythology. With all of Olympus dead and all of Greece basically destroyed at the hands of the ghost of Sparta, there weren't many stories left to tell there anyway. The new game takes place in the backdrop of Scandinavian or Norse mythology, in the land of Midgard for the most part. Considering how vast and rich this particular set of mythology is, there is obviously a lot that the game's story delves into, which is why before we jump into the actual narrative told in the game, we're going to have to talk a bit about the mythology itself and some of the stuff that acts as backstory to the game. Thanks in large part to Marvel, several names and terms from the Norse myths have become common knowledge. Odin, Thor, Loki, Ragnarok, and more are names and terms that a lot of people are very familiar with. This game, however, takes a different approach to these, since it is in many ways a more accurate representation of the mythology. The game takes place before the time of the Vikings. As per Norse mythology, the world that we know of is not the only one in existence. There are 9 realms in total that all overlap and exist within the same physical space, but on different planes of existence. Of these 9, the ones that are pertinent to the story of this game in particular are Midgard, which is this world, the world of humans and animals; Helheim or Hel, the land of the dead, basically the Norse equivalent of the Greek underworld; Alfheim, the realm of the dark and light elves; Jotunheim, the realm of the race of giants, who don't have to be actual physical giants, mind you; Asgard, the world of the sect of gods known as the Aesir, led by their king Odin, also often referred to as the Allfather; and Vanaheim, home of another sect of gods known as the Vanir. And these 2 different sects of gods, as you can imagine, aren't too friendly with each other. Before we move ahead though, let's discuss something that's going to be necessary cursory knowledge for a lot of the stuff that happens in the game. There are 9 realms in existence, as we've discussed, but how exactly is travel between them possible? It is possible, of course, through the Bifrost. In the actual pages of Norse mythology, the Bifrost is described as a rainbow bridge of light that connects Asgard to the rest of the realms. But in the world of this game, it's a device that can be used to harness forces that allow travel between realms. For obvious reasons, this knowledge is going to be important going forward. But with that out of the way though, let's get back to what we were talking about. The 2 factions of gods known as the Aesir and the Vanir have been at war for a long time. The Vanir are users of magic and other ethereal powers, while the Aesir are more militaristic. And in a nutshell, it was the Vanir's potent knowledge of these magical abilities that would lead to constant conflicts between the 2 sects. There's a lot more to it, but let's not go into that much detail right now. Instead, let's talk about the war between these 2 factions of gods itself. The war between the Aesir and Vanir was long and bloody, and took a toll on all concerned. Both the factions were very powerful, and for the most part they were both stuck in a stalemate. One would notch a mighty victory over the other, before the other would promptly proceed to do just the same. This war between the two also hurt Midgard and the other realms, where the other races would often get stuck in the crossfire. Both the Aesir and the Vanir eventually realized that the war was going nowhere, there was no end in sight, and the destruction it had wrought upon all the 9 realms was horrific to behold. And so, with no victory in sight for either of them, the two factions arrived at a compromise to put an end to their continually mounting losses. With the help of the arbitration from a man named Mimir, the smartest man in all the realms, the Vanir and the Aesir forged a truce for peace. As part of this truce, the Vanir goddess Freyja married Odin, the king of the Aesir. Not that she wanted to. All she had in her heart for the Allfather and the rest of the Aesir was contempt, but with the promise of peace, she decided to make the ultimate sacrifice and agreed to the marriage. As you may have guessed, the peace didn't last long. Odin, you see, was a god who was as hungry for absolute power as he was for absolute knowledge. For instance, a long time ago, it had actually been Tyr, the peace-loving Norse god of war, yes, we get the contradiction, who had been the leader of the Aesir. But Odin's hunger for power and his fear for being overpowered and ousted by Tyr eventually led to the Allfather overthrowing and killing Tyr. This was, in many ways, emblematic of the kind of mindset that Odin possessed, and it was these very flaws in his character that led to the breaking of the uneasy union between himself and Freyja. It all started with Odin's obsession of Ragnarok, an event that was foretold to be the end of the world and the destruction of the gods. Odin feared that when Ragnarok came around, it would be the giants, also known as the Jotun, who would be the ultimate enemies of the gods. And of course, that was something he was intent on avoiding. And so he hatched a plan to destroy the race of the giants in order to prevent Ragnarok before it even began. Odin hired 2 master blacksmiths, the dwarven brothers Brock and Sindri, to forge a weapon with which he could achieve his Herculean task, and boy did they deliver. They created the hammer known as Mjolnir, and Odin gave this hammer to his son Thor, the god of thunder. He then tasked him with using it to kill every giant in all the 9 realms, and Thor was only too happy to do so. This act of genocide, however, was something Freyja could not tolerate, and as such, she decided to leave Odin and return home. The vile and cruel king of the Aesir, however, obviously wasn't going to just sit back and let that happen. You see, during their marriage, Freyja had begun growing more content with the uncomfortable alliance between the 2 tribes, and though she had no love for Odin himself, the peace that their marriage had led to had made the union between the 2 slightly more tolerable to her. During all the years the 2 of them spent as husband and wife, Freyja willingly taught Odin the ways of Vanir magic, something the Aesir themselves weren't too familiar with, and Odin soaked in all the new information readily. And so it was that when, years later, Freyja decided to leave Odin upon seeing his genocide of the giants, the Allfather had become so powerful in Vanir magic that he decided to use Freyja's own weapons against her. Using Vanir magic, Odin placed a curse on Freyja that was manifold in its implications. Firstly, he made it so that for the rest of her life, Freyja would be unable to use her abilities to hurt another being. Odin did this so that she wouldn't be able to use her vast knowledge of Vanir magic to fight against the Aesir. But in effect, it also meant that she couldn't even defend herself if the need ever arose. More importantly though, Odin made it so that Freyja couldn't travel to other realms and would remain stuck in Midgard forever. Even if she tried, she would promptly be teleported back to Midgard. And so, Freyja sought exile in Midgard itself, where she'd remain in isolation and away from Odin and his Aesir followers. Odin's assault on the giants, however, continued even so. With Mjolnir in his possession, Thor lay waste to a great number of giants across all the realms, and as it became clearer and clearer to the Jotun that they may not be able to survive the Aesir's onslaught, they decided that it was time to fall back. They fled from all the realms and returned to their own, and before doing so, they destroyed all the portals and gateways in all the realms that led into Jotunheim, so that no one would be able to follow them back. They didn't all leave though. One of the giants, who they called their guardian, decided to stay behind in Midgard. and it was the Guardian's purpose to let the Jotun know if the time ever came for them to safely come back out of Jotunheim into the other realms. It is in the backdrop of all this that this game's story takes place, a few centuries presumably after the giants' retreat to Jotunheim. It has been a few years, we don't know exactly how many, since Kratos murdered the entire pantheon of Greeks and brought their land to ruin. He has since moved to Midgard, where he lives in isolation and voluntary exile, where he also met a woman named Faye, fell in love with her and married her, later giving birth to a child named Atreus. And while Faye was aware of Kratos' past and his status as a god, the two of them have, for all these years, presumably been at the behest of Kratos himself and kept all of his secrets from Atreus. The game begins right after Faye has died. Why has she died? Well, we don't know that. We just know that she died pretty recently. We'll probably find out more in the sequels. And Kratos and Atreus are making preparations for her cremation and what lies beyond. Because, notably enough, before dying, Faye conveyed her final wish to Kratos and Atreus, that her ashes be spread from the highest peak in all the 9 realms. And so, once they've cremated Faye's corpse, the father and son duo plan on making the journey to the peak of a towering mountain not far from their home. Kratos, however, is not entirely sure if Atreus is ready to make the journey. The world of Norse mythology is a brutal, vicious one. As Kratos puts it himself, it's no place for a child, but one only for a warrior. And not only is Atreus a child, he also has a history of a strange sickness that renders him incapable of even remaining conscious, much less doing anything else. What exactly this sickness is something we'll delve into in Part 8. Given how young Atreus is though, and how crippling his sickness can potentially be when triggered, even though at the beginning of the game, Atreus hasn't been sick for some time now, Kratos isn't sure if his son is ready to make the journey to the top of the mountain. He means to find out though. As soon as they set fire to Faye's pyre, Kratos tells Atreus that they're going on a hunt, with his intention being to use the hunt as a means to keep an eye on him and figure out whether or not he can survive the journey ahead. During the course of their hunt, it immediately becomes apparent that Kratos has changed a lot in the years since he killed Zeus. He is older, calmer, more collected. His weapon of choice has changed. He now wields an axe called the Leviathan, a magically infused weapon that flies back into his hand from wherever it is when he summons it. He's still very much the Kratos we know, but his interactions with Atreus show that he's trying to change, as much for the benefit of his son as for himself. He often loses his temper, but quickly collects himself, takes a deep breath, and carries on in a calmer fashion. He still possesses the raw, visceral strength he used in the past, but he now tempers that strength and rage more effectively, acting in situations rather than reacting to them. He no longer has the chained blades of chaos that were with him for decades in Greece, and he hides the scars that they left behind on his arms with straps of clothing, a representation of his guilt and shame. Make no mistake though, this isn't some mopey, sappy man who's terrified of what he used to be. He is still a monster, and he knows it, and he has accepted it. He only means to hide that monstrosity because he knows what it can do when it's left unchecked, and because he wants to set a better example for his son. His son, though, has problems of his own, it seems. At the end of their hunt, Atreus and Kratos get ambushed by a troll. And though Kratos manages to defeat the beast, a lowly troll obviously wouldn't be much of a challenge for the ghost of Sparta, he isn't too impressed with how Atreus handles himself. The boy, as Kratos calls him more often than not, is rash and often acts hastily. And though he is mostly a friendly, well-mannered kid, he's often also quick to temper, a trait he inherits from his father, unfortunately. Kratos, of course, is not a man to mince words, and he tells Atreus with unflinching bluntness that he's not ready to leave the confines of their home, and that, as such, they will not be travelling to the top of the mountain. Atreus is understandably enough disappointed, and though he tries to argue with Kratos and make his case, his father promptly shuts him down, after which the two of them make their way home. As soon as they get back home, though, things dramatically take a turn for the worst, setting into motion a thrilling and memorable chain of events. While Kratos and Atreus are inside their house, Kratos hears the voice of a man from the outside, telling him to come out and face him. Kratos immediately realizes that whoever this person is, he's not exactly friendly, and that things here might turn quite ugly. In light of that, he tells Atreus to hide under the floorboards of their house, and while Atreus first protests, mentioning how Kratos has up until now always told him never to go down there, Kratos quickly tells him to do as he says. As soon as Atreus hides, Kratos walks out to face the stranger outside. It instantly becomes clear that this stranger is here for a very specific purpose. What that is, though, is not really very clear at this point. And who exactly is this stranger? The game likes keeping its cards pretty close to its chest, and while this isn't revealed right away, the game eventually does reveal that he's none other than the Aesir god Boulder, the son of the king of the Aesir, Odin himself. His demeanor is aggressive, and he quickly hurls one insult after another at Kratos, who somehow keeps a lid on his rage and tries, surprisingly enough, to understand what's going on. He implies that Kratos knows something that he wants to know as well, and threatens him by telling him that if he doesn't acquiesce to his demands, things will get violent. Kratos, who for now has no idea, tells him that he has no clue what he's talking about, but the stranger doesn't buy it. Predictably enough, things get out of hand, going from 0 to 1,000,000 in a fraction of a second. The conversation between the two quickly devolves into a fistfight as Boulder continues to demand that Kratos do what he says, and soon the fistfight turns into something right out of a Dragon Ball Z episode. The two of them punch each other into oblivion, hurling everything from trees to boulders at each other. At one point, Boulder realizes that there may be someone else inside Kratos' house beside the man himself. Kratos in turn realizes that Atreus might be in danger, and he well and truly loses it. The ghost of Sparta flies into a characteristically typical fit of Spartan rage, wrecking Boulder with everything that he can get his hands on. Boulder, though, doesn't seem to feel any of it. All the while he's smiling, hell, even laughing like a maniac, even as he's getting stabbed through the gut with the trunk of a tree. Why exactly is that the case? Well, Boulder, you see, cannot feel any kind of pain whatsoever, physical or mental. He is essentially invincible. The fight quickly turns in the Spartan's favor, and he crushes Boulder beneath the weight of a massive boulder, bringing the proceedings to a conclusion. In the aftermath, as he looks around, Kratos sees that the entire landscape in the vicinity has changed as a result of their skirmish. The faces of entire foothills are crumbling, humongous trees have been uprooted entirely, there's debris and rubble everywhere, and there are even massive fissures in the ground where none had previously existed. Given the stuff Kratos has seen and caused in the past, though, this is not even par for the course for this game. It's basically inconsequential. What matters is the fact that Kratos realizes that he and Atreus can stay here no longer. The presence of the stranger poses a threat that Kratos does not understand and could not have foreseen, and even though he believes him to be dead, he knows that staying at their house could prove to be fatally dangerous for Atreus, even more so than journeying to the top of the mountain. And so, he decides that that is what they must do. As soon as Kratos arrives back at his house and brushes aside questions and remarks by his son about who the stranger was and what he wanted, neither of which the Spartan has answers to, the two of them set off for the highest peak in all the realms to spread the ashes of Fae. As you can imagine, their journey is an interesting one from start to finish, and as soon as they leave the isolation of the forest they'd been living in and enter into the larger outside world of Midgard, things immediately become eventful, to say the least. As they're rowing their boat in a lake known as the Lake of Nine, they encounter Jormungandr, also known as the World Serpent, which is what we'll be referring to it as, since it's much easier to say. Who or what exactly is the World Serpent? Well, it belongs to the race of giants, and it's said to be so large that it can wrap itself around the entirety of the world and grab the end of its tail with its mouth. The World Serpent's very existence in Midgard at this moment, though, is a very curious thing. It's not to be confused with the Guardian left in Midgard by the giants, a figure we'll be speaking of in greater detail later on, because the serpent, you see, is a thing of the future. It shares a deep, hateful enmity with Thor, the god of thunder, and in the future, during the events of Ragnarok, Thor apparently hit it with his hammer so hard that it actually came unstrung in time and got knocked back into the past, where it is even now. The world serpent that Kratos and Atreus meet in the Lake of Nine is from the future, and in their present, chronologically speaking, it hasn't even been born yet. Its very presence in this moment is, in essence, the very definition of a causality loop. In spite of its intimidatingly gargantuan size and its terrifying face though, the world serpent, as it turns out, doesn't prove to be an adversary for Kratos and Atreus. As the game progresses, both they and we, the player, find out bit by bit that the serpent is actually more of an ally, and it's going to be vital to a lot of major story developments as we move forward, so keep these details in mind. For now though, let's move forward with the recap, because Jormungandr, have to admit, much easier to pronounce the second time, is not the only notable character the Spartan father and son meet. They also meet a pair of dwarven master blacksmith brothers named Brock and Sindri. Remember them? They're the same smiths who, at the behest of Odin, made Mjolnir for Thor, so we know for a fact that they have serious chops when it comes to crafting mythical, overpowered weapons. But Mjolnir is not the only badass weapon they've ever made. Turns out they're also the ones who made Leviathan, Kratos' axe, which, incidentally, has recalling powers similar to those that Thor's Mjolnir does. But while the dwarves, also known as the Huldra brothers, are renowned across the realms for their smithing skills, they're not getting along very well these days. Due to disagreements over the direction they felt their business should take next, the two of them split their practice half and half years ago, and to this day they're not on speaking terms. Throughout the game, whenever Kratos and Atreus encounter Brock and Sindri, they're more often than not bickering about the other, something that provides some very welcome comic relief in the game. However, they're also important to the story itself. For instance, it turns out that Brock and Sindri made the Leviathan for Faye, Kratos' wife, long ago before she even met Kratos. The two of them, in fact, considered her to be a good friend, and when they find out that Kratos is the dead woman's husband and Atreus her son, and that Faye passed her axe down to Kratos, they both individually voluntarily offer their aid to the Spartan and his son. In terms of gameplay, this takes the form of upgrading and crafting equipment. Another interesting personality Kratos and Atreus meet while they're making their way to the mountain is a woman who is known only as the Witch of the Woods, who we will speak of in far greater detail in the next part of this series. The witch is surprisingly adept at performing ancient magic, and seems to be greatly in touch with nature and the natural things of the world around her, from the flora to the fauna. She lives deep within the isolation of a forest, and her house is buried beneath a tree which, incidentally, is growing on the back of a massive turtle. So yeah, she basically lives inside a turtle. Kratos' demeanor towards the witch, just as with Brock and Sindri and basically every single person he ever meets, is cold, distant, and untrusting at best, but she quickly takes a liking to Atreus and he to her. And rather quickly, she also proves to be a valuable asset for the two of them. As Kratos and Atreus make their way up the mountain, they encounter obstacles beyond their understanding. Obstacles that nothing of the world they live in can possibly overcome. With the help of the Witch of the Woods though, the father and son are able to travel between realms to gather what they need to continue their journey to the highest peak in all the 9 realms. And that's where we're going to end part 7. In part 8, with the required basic information about Norse mythology and its important characters out of the way, we'll be focusing much more on the actual narrative of the game itself. Stay tuned.
And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.